I actually sat in on a similar webinar a couple of months ago that he put on regarding tapping stained trees, maple trees, I should say, as well as the yields that they produce. So I found it to be extremely interesting, and I reached out to Mark to ask him to speak to us about it. Obviously knowing that we have a good constituency of maple producers up here, and maybe not after this week, but since we're still collecting sap from trees. So I'm very excited to have Mark here, and I appreciate his time. So Mark, when you're ready, please take it away. Thank you. Mark, you're muted if that helps.
Great. Hey everyone, Katie, thanks very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to get it, and I'm happy to join you. We have I would say the maple season is just kicking off here in northern Vermont. So we're a little bit colder climate, and today is the first real sugaring day for a lot of folks. A little bit here and there, but today's it's really gushing. So after I talk to you, I'm going to be heading out. So appreciate your time, and we will jump right into it. Can everyone see my slides okay? Just want to make sure. Yep. Okay, great. So let me see if I can get the slide. Does not want to advance. That is strange. I am gonna need to figure this out. Oh, there it goes. Okay. Sorry about that. So obviously I'm talking to a bunch of foresters, so they understand some of the basics about wounding and trees, but it's important that we're all on the same page. So first and foremost, trees are highly compartmentalized plants. So any of you who've studied anything by Alex Shigo understand the concept of the coated model, where trees have both physiological and anatomical capability to wall off infection. And Shigo designed the coated model around the idea of walls, and that there are different wall strengths within trees. He numbered them 1 through 4. And we'll talk briefly about what those are and why they're important in relation to sugaring. But really what's important to know is that something you already know. Trees are highly compartmentalized. They're not uniform in their structure below the bark. And what I assume you know already is that sugar maple is considered excellent at compartmentalization. Not all trees are. Some trees are not designed to withstand wounding. Sugar maple happens to be one of those that is quite good at it. In terms of sugaring, we know that sugar makers have to make new holes every year, and this is directly related to the tree's wound response. Trees respond to that wound with an active response. They devote energy in the form of carbohydrates, as well as their physical structure, the anatomical structures, in an effort to prevent systemic infection. Trees respond to wounds like tap holes or being basal damage at the base during harvest operations or from animals. They all respond by producing an area of what we call non-conductive wood. You can think of this as the stained wood that you see in response to injury. In sugaring, when we make a very clean drill hole into a stem of a tree, the tree responds to that by producing a volume of non-conductive wood roughly proportional to the diameter, but then extends far greater above and below that tap hole. And there are some pretty basic anatomical reasons why that is that we'll talk about. What's also important for sugar makers is that there aren't a whole lot of from the outside. This is sort of what that sugar maker was looking at. Here's just the outside of a sugar maple. It's really hard to tell where those old wounds and tap holes are. Maybe you're lucky and you get to see a little evidence like this that's etched in the bark, an old tap hole, but it doesn't really tell you exactly the extent of wounding or the non-conductive wood under the bark. What's also really important to note is that the tree responds to that wound by healing, by walling it off, but it does not fill in that hole. It adds new growth every year through its normal life practices, but the tree never fills in that old tap hole. Here's a microscopic image of a cross section of some sugar maple wood. And this might be going back a few years if you haven't looked at tree anatomy too recently. A lot of this will be review, I would imagine, for the professionals in the group. Those white circles that you're seeing are essentially the vessel elements. Those are the water conducting pipes that are used during the growing season to bring up all that massive amount of water from the ground up through the leaves in conjunction with photosynthesis. Those also happen to be the conducting pipes that we drill into when we are collecting sap in the springtime. So we're severing those vessels. Hopefully it's a nice clean hole so we get ample sap flow and the weather cooperates. But we're cutting into those vessels. We're not harvesting sap from that, what appears to be more of a pale yellow colored tissue. Those are the fibers. Those are the parts of the wood that is giving the tree its strength and preventing it from snapping over in a windstorm. Now, this section of sugar maple has been stained with iodine, which was a good clue as to what those dark lines are that are oriented roughly vertically. Those are the ray cells, and that's where the non-structural carbohydrates are stored, the product of photosynthesis. Obviously, a tree has to maintain its life during the dormant season. The tree does that by storing abundant non-structural carbohydrates and then converting those from starch to sugar when they need it. A tree will use non-structural carbohydrates in the wound response system. In other words, it's an active process that the tree devotes energy to, and it does so in competition with other needs for that non-structural carbohydrates. You can prove this pretty easily by drilling into a milled sugar maple board, and you don't see that staining. It has to be a living plant for that wound response to take place. So if you remember, I said that Shigo talked about the walls in the Codit model, the compartmentalization of decay in trees. He talked about the walls in terms of numbers, one being the weakest wall, or the one that's most permeable to infection, up to wall 4, which is considered the strongest wall. Wall 1 forms here in the vessels, in those relatively large vessel elements, the ones that conduct sap in the springtime and water during the growing season. It takes the tree quite a bit to shut this system down because it is so efficient at moving moisture. Some have suggested this is a bit like closing the doors on a submarine. You know, you can do it. It's just really hard to do it with all that pressure. So the tree eventually does shut down those pipes, and that's really the reason why you see that staining column extend above and below the tap hole more than side to side. So wall 2 is a little stronger than wall 1, and wall 2 is formed by that late wood, that thicker walled late season wood that's laid down near the end of the growing season. That is a little bit stronger barrier than wall 1, so that's where you're seeing it highlighted with those red dots. Now we're going to zoom out a little bit and look at wall 3. Here's a zoomed out cross section of a sugar maple tree that has been tapped previously. You may recognize that the tap hole is there. It's still hollow. So like I said earlier, the tree does not fill in that hole with new wood. It just encapsulates it in a new layer of wood as the tree is growing. But when that injury takes place, the ray cells that are running radially from the center of the tree outwards, those provide an even better barrier to infection than wall 2. So wall 3 extends just a little bit beyond where that tap hole is drilled. So you can see that staining extends just a little bit from the edge of that tap hole, but not a huge amount. Now wall 4, I will take another picture here. Wall 4 is actually that barrier between the wood that existed when the injury took place, and that could be a tap hole, it could be a woodpecker hole, it could be a basal damage from skitter. When the wood existed at that moment of injury, and then the next year's growing, the next year's wood. So you can see that barrier, there's virtually no staining beyond in that new wood. That's the strongest barrier, is wall 4. While we're here looking at this zoomed in picture of the old tap hole, I'll point out a few things. One, look at the amazing amount of growth right around that tap hole. You know, that isn't true, not the same as the wood that is part of the annual growth ring. It's more like callus tissue. It's a heightened amount of growth, and the tree really responds to that to try to prevent systemic infection. The other thing that's important to note is if you look just near the bottom of that picture, you see that inside the tap hole, remember, this is buried within that living tree, in that void where that old tap hole was, there's actually bark there. The tree has actually formed new bark. And functionally speaking, inside that old tap hole, which is now buried within the tree, from the tree's perspective, that is the outside of the tree. The tree has provided a very, very effective barrier against infection. So we have walls 1 through 4 there. The columns of discoloration, they persist. They don't go away. They don't fade into the background. What happens is they become encased in yet another annual year's growth of wood. If a sugar maker stopped tapping completely and the tree just continued to grow, eventually those staining columns would be near the center of the tree. And so you can see the picture on the right, we have 2 trees, one that was tapped for a few years, and you see that non-conductive wood oriented vertically, roughly. And you see the tree on the left. Now, which one is easier to avoid hitting the stained wood? Obviously the one on the right. Luckily for the tree's survivability, they have that protective layer of bark. So the job is a little bit harder for sugar makers. One of the ways in which the industry has tried to avoid hitting stained wood during tapping is to recommend tapping patterns. And by that, I mean recommending a certain amount of distance above and a certain amount of distance across from old tap holes. So you might see recommendations of always go up 6 inches and over 4, or over 2 and up 10. There's a variety of different patterns out there, none of which are very rigorously investigated scientifically. And I'll talk a little bit about why patterns are a tough thing to recommend. Here's a quick picture to illustrate how non-conductive wood functions, or doesn't function for that matter. This is a picture taken by my predecessor, Tim Wilmot at UVM Extension. And there are 3 cookies here, and you can see the cookie second from the right is where the old tap hole was. And what he did was he tapped this tree, small sugar maple, but he tapped it, let the tree do the wound response process, and then he cut that section down, and while it was still green and fresh, he put a massive amount of pressure and pushed this dye through the stem. And you can see the dye infiltrated all those vessels in the xylem, except for that tiny little heart in the center and that area around the staining column. So another good illustration of how that wound response is really effective at preventing moisture from moving throughout the tree. Another reason why staining column, another reason why pattern tapping is not always the best way to go is that we have some data from a colleague of mine, Dr. Abby Vandenberg, and she has looked at hundreds and hundreds of cross sections and dissected sugar maples that have been tapped. And she's found a huge amount of variability in the volume of that staining column. And by a huge amount of variability, I mean anywhere from 20 to 200 times the tap hole size. So that's a huge amount of variability. And you can imagine if you have a tree that isn't particularly good at compartmentalizing, you're going to run into that staining more often if you follow a tapping pattern that's based on a sort of more average level of staining column size. The other thing I want to point out is that the staining column, even though most of my illustrations and even some of those pictures have shown, staining columns don't always follow this neat vertical pattern. Anyone who's ever worked with wood will recognize this as being a true statement. The grain of the wood, the way the vessels are laid down, they're not always perfectly straight. And that can have an impact on whether or not your pattern holds up over time. I do want to point out that this illustration and some of the other pictures are highlighted in a video series that we have through the University of Vermont Proctor Maple Research Center, and it was a collaboration between several parts of the University of Vermont and folks who look at maple. So feel free to check that out. The series is on YouTube under Keys to High Sap Yields. So what problem is this? How often do people actually hit brown or stained wood? We asked just over 300 maple producers to answer that question, and this is the response we got. So we had almost half the people saying, well, I hit it maybe 2 to 4% of the time. Then there were about a quarter who said I never hit it, and then maybe another roughly quarter, a little more than a quarter, who say, well, it's something over 5%, 5 to 9 or more than 10. So people are certainly paying attention a bit. We know from experience at the Proctor Maple Research Center, we tap about 5,000 trees, and we didn't really have a good handle on how often we are hitting it until we are measuring every single time we tapped, every single tree. We make a tick mark if we hit brown wood. And what we found is we are close to 10%. And we thought we were doing well. 10%, as my data will show in a little bit, is a significant amount. So I think people are paying a little bit of attention. My guess is that the numbers are actually higher than I think people hit it more often. What are the impacts? So what? If you hit stained wood, you get a little less sap, but how much less? Maple tubing has made sugaring more accessible for different areas of land. It's made it more viable because there's far less labor involved. You don't have to go to every tree and haul a bucket of sap. So tubing has had a major impact on the expansion of the maple crop in the US and Canada. But one of the things it doesn't do is it doesn't tell you how much each individual tree is producing. And so although sugar makers intuitively know they're getting less sap when they hit brown wood, they don't know what the magnitude is. And that's where this project comes in. I did a small study and I tapped 20 trees that had a history of being tapped previously. And I had individual trees running into individual chambers so I could measure just the amount of sap going from each tap hole, and did that throughout the whole season. These were gravity lines, but they were set up in a way to generate good natural vacuum. So it was mimicking what a modern operation would produce in terms of total yield. Those 20 trees were divided into two groups. 10 trees were tapped intentionally, if I could, into that stained column from previous tap holes. And so I tapped 1 inch above the previous tap hole. Not at all recommended practice, by the way, but that was the point, trying to hit that stained column. And I put that asterisk there to remind me to say that in that, just those 10 trees, 3 out of the 10, I did not hit stained wood, which was remarkable in one of those great scientific ways in that I expected one result and I got a bit of results that were different than I anticipated. So I think the key here is that even 1 inch above an existing tap hole, if the vessels are not oriented perfectly vertically, you can have an area with perfectly conductive wood directly above a tap hole. And I think what this really says is it makes it difficult to follow a strict pattern, because the staining column can be oriented more in a 45 or some other direction. The other 10 trees were tapped into clean wood, and total sap production for both 2018 and 2019 was collected. This picture on the right shows you an example of a tree that has had previous tapping and then has had some growth. So there's conductive wood that's been laid down after that tap hole was made. And then obviously we have the bark for protecting. What I did was I collected every bit of wood that came out of the tap hole. I collected it in a pretty awkward way. I had a plastic bin kind of strapped around my waist and was directly underneath my drill. But I collected all the chips and I was able to bring them into the lab and sort them and measure the differences. So that's a bit how the experiment was laid out in terms of methods. That's a little bit what it looked like when the chips were collected in my plastic bin. I put them in a vessel, a little vial, and brought them back to the lab for sorting. Here's an example of one tap hole that I intentionally hit into non-conductive wood. You can see a difference there, I hope. And once in the lab, I needed to sort them. And that's usually pretty easy, although you might get a couple that had a little bit of conductive wood and then a little more non-conductive wood. And so I would separate those as well to try to get the most accurate numbers. And after sorting, you can see, this is, when we talk to sugar makers about what they should be seeing coming out of the tap hole, it's this on the left. It's nice, kind of creamy colored, a little bit springy, a little bit moist, but obviously not sopping wet wood chips, and then the bark on the right. And then if we hit one that is stained wood, obviously they're dark colored. They're not a kind of a springy consistency, and the little bit of conductive wood that was in this tap hole is in the middle, and then the bark is on the right. So when I actually looked at individual tree basis, how much sap you get when you hit stained wood versus not, this is what I got. 2018, we saw a 75% reduction in sap yield when you hit stained wood. Now, obviously, there is some variability. Some had a little bit more, some had a little less. But on average, it was 75% less in 2018 and 70% less in 2019. So a big impact on total yield. Now remember, this reduction, this is at the beginning. This is off the top. This is before, the weather doesn't really cooperate to be a good season, or a squirrel finds your tubing system really attractive and makes a lot of holes, or you have a windstorm that knocks things down, or your vacuum pump blows up. All those things that can and do happen in sugaring, the impact is right off the top, and you're going to get even less as a result of those other things that happen during sugaring. So very, very significant result. When you combine the two and you actually look at the data in terms of how much stained wood, remember I sorted out the chips and looked at as a percent how much of the tap hole was conductive versus non-conductive. There's a very nice, strong linear relationship that shows the more stained wood you tap into, the less sap you get. And of course, this is not necessarily groundbreaking, but to actually have numbers to point to the fact that there is an impact is really helpful. And we haven't had that before, in a modern type maple operation. So the outputs of this, this is certainly one, communicating with professionals and sugar makers, trying to get the word out about what we found. We also have, a more condensed, like I mentioned, the more condensed YouTube videos, which are available through the Proctor Maple Research Center website. We also do personal communication. If people call, we pick up the phone for anyone in the maple industry. We do not discriminate against people who are in Vermont or out of Vermont. So feel free to contact me if you have questions, or know landowners or sugar makers who have questions. And then we also have some trade journals. The maple industry has a few publications that sugar makers check out, and so we've been able to spread the word that way. the next steps? What are we hoping to gain by this information beyond just enlightening and educating folks? Well, for one, we want to try to update recommendations on tapping so that people are taking a little bit more time and being a little bit more cautious about how they tap. Yeah, a lot of times when tapping time comes around, everyone wants to get involved. It's really exciting. People want to help, and that's great. But I hope I've expressed how important it is to make sure that tap hole is 100% conductive right off the bat. So maybe it's not the time to have that really energetic high school kid who, just had 3 Red Bulls and is looking to set a new record for the number of tap holes in a day. Maybe it's a little bit more focused, a little more cautious when it comes to tapping. The other important thing is we hope that this will lead to a little bit more emphasis on good forest management, because as we have said, healthy trees putting on more conductive wood, that will lessen the likelihood that you will hit stained wood because the tree is accumulating more faster, and hopefully that will get folks' attention too. I often say in groups of maple producers, thinning, careful management, that's good. A little is good, a lot is not necessarily better. Sugar maple, although it's very good at compartmentalizing, can be sensitive to excessive release. So when we're talking about crop tree release, we often recommend maybe 1 or 2 sides, but not all 4 at once. And especially if there are some microsite issues with moisture or some other things where those trees are already maybe a little bit stressed, to just tread lightly. And we do want to give them room to grow, give them ample sunlight, but overdoing it, especially if it's in anticipation of a new tubing system, we want to be careful that we're not setting these crop trees up for decline. So increasing producer awareness about that, and really just trying to better understand that relationship between growth and accumulating non-conductive wood and ultimately sustainability. This picture on the right, I don't know if it's obvious or not, but it's a roadside bucket tree, sugar maple, nice country road, which really fits that image of sugaring for a lot of people. I'm sure it's true in Ohio as it is in Vermont. A lot of people see that and yeah, that's sugaring. But if you look closer at that bark, I counted 10 or 11 tap holes all within just that little area. There's a lot of non-conductive wood accumulated right in that one zone. And part of it has to do with the bucket system, where you're not really going to put a bucket way above your head, and you're not going to space it out as much, but really try to make sure people are understanding how the tree's physiology and wound response impacts production, but also the health of the tree. So that's what I got for you, and I'd be happy to answer questions if we have time. I haven't been able to check my watch while we're talking here, but if you'd like, I'm happy to take some questions, Katie.
Yeah, for sure. And we do have about 10, 12 minutes. There's a question from Dan Castellucci. He says, working in Northeast Ohio, I have a lot of maple producing clients. They struggle with removal of any maple. Can you point to some publications that help understand the timber versus tapping conundrum?
I didn't quite hear the last bit. You said the difference between...
Yeah, versus timber and tapping, as far as selecting trees, to be able to achieve both management goals. Do you know of any publications that are out there that we might be able to distribute to our property owners?
Well, there has been some work looking at the net present value. There have been several bodies of work looking at what's the long-term gain from sugaring versus timber production. Sugaring almost always wins out in terms of long-term gain. Some of that has to do with the annual income related to sugaring versus the longer interval between harvests and how variable prices can be. That's not to say that every timber harvest is going to bring the landowner less money than going sugaring, but in general, sugaring will outperform in terms of economics. Is part of the question about balancing doing both? I'm still not quite sure about the question. If he wants to jump on and ask it.
He says maybe the better question is production of sap in an overstocked stand versus a thin stand.
Boy, that's a really good one. So we are working on developing a calculator where you can enter just basic cruise information. So mean stand diameter, basal area per acre, and get some sense of what your yield would be from a average tubing system. It's not quite ready yet, but it's an interesting thing because for a long time, the ideal sugar bush were these large, decadent, widely spaced, mature sugar maples. And that isn't the case anymore. And people are still achieving high yields, even though they don't reach that stage. It's probably better too, because they have multiple age classes and it's more sustainable. I think I can't point to one document and suggest you read it. It is kind of an area of work that hasn't had a lot of attention in the last 30 years. Most of the research has been focused on maximizing yields and finding technology to be able to increase yields. My background, my undergrad is in forestry, and so I've been trying to incorporate more of that forestry into maple because it's obviously a huge part of the process that just hasn't had as much attention. So if you want to email me, I can point you to a few places, but there isn't that one. Oh, of course, here's the stocking guide. I can't do that.
Great, thank you for that.
Yep.
Does anybody else have any questions for Mark, especially us Northeast foresters? Let me just scroll through here and see if we have anybody raising their hand.
I know I have heard from folks like Gary Graham and Les Ober that there were some real issues with sugar bushes being cut. And they were looking, I think maybe even legislatively, to see if there could be some incentives to make sure that sugar bushes were kept in maple. And I don't know if there's been any movement in that, but it did seem like there were some pretty productive sugar bushes that were being cut. So
Okay.
That's sort of my most recent connection with forestry in Ohio.
Okay. Does anybody else have any other questions for Mark?
Well, feel free to reach out in the future if you want. Was there someone there? No. Okay.
I don't see anybody else at the moment.
Well, you can search for UVM Extension Maple and find the page that I help maintain. There's also the Proctor Maple Research webpage and the videos on YouTube. So happy to share what we have.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for this. Like I had mentioned earlier, I sat in on this topic, the webinar that you guys did. I think it was in the fall, and it was fascinating. So I know there are other webinars that you guys have recorded and that are available for viewing. So it's another great resource to pass along to our property owners who are interested in managing for maple production. So.
Yeah, we put all the recordings of the Vermont Maple conferences are on that UVM Extension Maple page, and so we have one on sugarbush silviculture. We have some on maple pests. So they're trying to build more and more forestry-related content, as well as the kind of bread and butter maple specific stuff. So
awesome,
great. All right, well, enjoy the rest of your meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. We appreciate it. I don't see any other questions popping in or hands raised or anything. So, so thank you for your time. Thanks for jumping in and talking to us over here in Ohio. We appreciate that very much.
Okay.
So.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mark. So we have a couple more minutes until our last speaker of the day. Why don't we go ahead and just take a quick, 5-ish minute break, and then we'll get started.